Okay, so welcome everyone to the April session of the Transmedia Arts Seminar, hosting Professor Jennifer Parker Starbuck's talk entitled Animals in the Machine, Robotic Animals Agents. My name is Hannah Borden and I am a professor of theater and performance studies at Barnard College, Columbia University, and I co-chair the Transmedia Arts Seminar with my colleague, Professor Magda Romanska, who is based at the Emerson College and who shares the same field with me. So before I welcome our speaker, let me thank the Mahindra Humanities Center and MetaLab, both at Harvard University, for their co-sponsorship and support of this seminar. Also, let me note how you can participate in the discussion we will have after the talk, which will take about an hour. So during or after the talk, you can submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you prefer to interact via voice and image, it's possible as well. As you could hear, we are recording the webinar and plan to post it on the Mahindra Humanities Center website. So if you participate in an identifiable way, please be mindful that by doing so, you are authorizing the use of the recording in this way. If you would like to participate but anonymously, you can do so under an alias and by turning your video off. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Professor Jennifer Parker Starbuck, who is the head of School of Performing and Digital Arts at Royal Holloway, University of London. Having published many book chapters and journal articles, she's the author of the monograph Cyborg Theatre, co-author of Performance and Media, Taxonomies for a Changing Field, and co-editor of the collection Performing Animality, Animals in Performance Practices. From 2015 to 2019, she was the editor of Theatre Journal. At this time, she is a contributing editor to PAG, a journal of performance art, and the International Journal of Performing Arts and Digital Media. She's also a theme leader for StoryLab, a strand of the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded Creative Clusters program, Story Futures. So Jen, we are very excited about your talk. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that introduction. And thank you to Magda and you, Hannah, again, for inviting me to participate in this exciting series. And thanks also to the Metal Lab and Mahindra Humanities Center for sponsoring the Transmedia Arts Seminar. When Magda and Hannah asked me to participate, I really had no idea what I would be thinking about today. I certainly didn't expect a year of pandemic. I'm speaking tonight from London, so it's 10 p.m. here. Thanks to all of you out there who are here in London with me. Forgive me for any forgetfulness at the end of a long day. And we're still largely in lockdown, with stores and restaurants only slowly opening this week, and theaters, museums, and cultural sites still closed. So while this talk will cover much of what was advertised, it is from a developing project, but I'm also compelled to reframe it through the lens of the past year. A year in a pandemic. In some ways, a very theatrical year. The virus actor has run amok, creating dramatic arcs, global characters, and of course, great tragedy. We are watching each other through proscenium frames, unwilling to risk infection, but held wrapped by the unfolding narrative. It is a year that foregrounds plots of human, non-human animal technologization, teaching us about zoonotic diseases, destructions of habitats, food production. It has also given us some animal-themed comic interludes and entertainment. I put this in because to follow a link to Larry's talk from last time, and there are so many seagulls there. And Also, this wasn't exactly animal themed, but I did get to play the platypus in The Tempest, so I was interested in that. And we're hopefully now concluding with vaccines made by the help of histories of animal testing. Generally thought to have originated in bats via another species, pangolins perhaps, the coronavirus is a zoonotic virus, one that crosses species boundaries, animal to human. It is, it is not the first such virus, nor will it be the last, due to increasing human encroachment on animal habitats, and because of what I'm calling a technologized animality. By this, I mean several interconnected human, non-human animal technological relations. The first is the use of animal species as a technology. You can think, for example, of the history of horses and their use in labor pre-mechanization, or the animal standing in as an object for experimentation and testing. Here it's the live animal itself that acts as a tool for human use. The second is the transfer of animal species into and onto technology. We might think of cinematic animals or animated animals or anthropomorphized animals in advertisements. As Akira Mizuta Lippitt has expressed in his book Electric Animal, quote, cinema, communication, transportation, and electricity drew from the actual and phantasmatic resources of dead animals, end quote. The third is the technological processing of animals into other forms, factory farming for meat and dairy, the use of hides and fur for clothing, taxidermic practices. So technologized animality is a large term encompassing much of the way that humans see and use and understand different animal species. It's a condition in which humans, non-human animals, and technologies are placed in relation to each other, whether as separate entities or in what I would call cyborgian mergings. These are, I know, all very large and non-specific and definitively human constructed terms, which for now is intentional to encompass the scope and scale of our reliance on non-human animals. But I want to argue that we need to expand these parameters to find ways to give voice and agency to the non-human technologized animals in our midst. Within the pandemic year, we cycled through many of these categorizations of technologization, a full story circle of human-animal technological integration. There are many factors contributing to the increased zoonotic disease, but technologization is at the core. The destruction of animal habitats intersecting with food production processes increases the instances of viral crossings. It seems sadly ironic that the game that occupied many across the year is called Animal Crossing, where people passed a lot of time communing with a range of animated animals and human friends, yet echoing the theme of growth, building, and growing larger human habitats. And it's also worth noting, as John Oliver has humorously pointed out on his show, that Animal Crossing also brings together animals who shouldn't be in close proximity, a factor in the spread of zoonotic disease. And now finally, hopefully, we've reached the vaccine stage of the pandemic. And recently I received the first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a vaccine made from chimpanzee adenovirus vaccine vector that has been modified for humans. So while the past year has felt out of the ordinary in so many ways for so many of us, within the animal-human techno spectrum, it is typical. Humans rely on a combination of non-human animals and technologies, whether through labor, claiming their habitats, food processes, entertainment or animal testing, and humans must begin to acknowledge these non-human animal practices or risk increasing imbalances in environmental and health-related concerns. In Politics of Nature, Bruno Latour theorizes a new kind of political ecology, and he proposes a collective to replace dualities of politics and nature, a collective in which both humans and non-humans can act and are represented by collecting associations between humans and non-humans. And he writes, the real merit of militant ecology is the ever new surprise that comes when a new actor, human or non-human, emerges in the course of action when we least expect it. Enter the virus, for example. For Latour, humans and non-humans should be in an association, a term used to overcome a subject-object division in which its members have the potential to modify each other. It is this modification I too strive to identify through what I've called a becoming animate, which I've defined as a condition of sensory attunement, palpable and vibrant, that reveals the interrelationships and traces left between animal, human, and machine. I am, of course, playing upon Deleuze and Guattari's well-known becoming animal as I consider their concept in relation to the technological, thinking about it as a non-fixed idea that concerns alliance. Even if in this anthropocentric time, there may be no unmediated animal. I contend that the animal for the human is already deeply enmeshed with technological processes, animate. Becoming's animate, as I conceive it, might produce a reverberating kind of sensation, a retracing, or in Deleuze and Guattari's words, a contagion back to the human hand. My hope is that this might produce a kind of relational thinking that assigns more agency to the non-human animal actor. Latour points to this agency when he writes, this is one of my favorite quotes of his, as soon as we stop taking non-humans as objects, as soon as we allow them to enter the collective in the form of new entities with uncertain boundaries, entities that hesitate, quake, induce perplexity, it is not hard to see that we can grant them the designation of actors. So by examining how some of these still human-centric, human-driven practices shift human, non-human, animal, and technological entities towards more interreliant forms, I join others proposing alliances or associations to seek a more equally balanced theater of the world. Okay, I couldn't resist this slide. I saw it on a friend's Facebook and was struck by their term hygiene theater. So I just thought I'd include it. It was from yesterday or 2 days ago. In this Anthropocene age, humans have placed themselves at the top of a hierarchical order, and this positionality must be acknowledged and questioned. When I use the term human in distinction from non-human animals, this is not to simplify, but rather to begin to complicate this difference further through the addition of the technological and from multiple directions. I recognize the powerful hierarchy within the human species, placing privilege and progress in the hands of a largely white patriarchal structure. I do not disavow the many human-to-human hierarchies, even while introducing the non-human. And I follow Claire Jean Kim's thoughts in her book, Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, that it is stronger to think taxonomically rather than through dualisms. A position which, she says, encourages us to ask questions about relationality, positionality, and multidimensionality that are obscured by the dualism concept. And she aims to practice a multi-optic vision that entails seeing from within various perspectives, moving from one vantage point to another. In the contemporary moment, there are very visible problems to worry about: pandemics, police violence, human rights injustices, climate change, financial instability, and these are crucial to approach from many perspectives and hierarchies. My focus is to not turn away from these gravely human struggles, but to look at a less visibly acknowledged variable within these complex issues, the role of the non-human animal. I want to frame the non-human animal here as actor, even if in the examples that follow, it may not be a living animal. I'm searching for possibilities of non-human animal agency and more equal distribution of notions of respect and reliance. Alongside thinkers like Latour, Deleuze and Guattari, Jane Bennett in Vibrant Matter, and others, I trace some examples in which technologized animality might slowly be reframed so as to consider non-humans as dissenting figures, disrupting growing conflations between animals and technologies and producing different forms of communicative action. Robotic animal agents then might provide new techniques, as Jane Bennett has expressed, quote, in speech and art and mood to disclose the participation of humans and non-humans in our world, end quote. Keeping in mind that, as this quote suggests, we inevitably recognize the anthropocentrism implied in our world, I introduce the following examples to begin to trouble the exclusively human-driven, examples that slowly draw the elements together so that they might imprint upon or leave traces within each other. So, why animal robots? My research continues to be driven by the attempts to rethink ideas of subjectivity through human technological intersections as a cyborg theater, and has since evolved into two strands. One, work on immersive storytelling, AR and VR technologies, and the other, of which this talk is part, develops the cyborg theater through a triangular relationship between technologies, humans, and non-humans in art and performance installation, in VR, and in robotics. This shifting research terrain has allowed me to become attuned to the many practices that involve and include non-human animals. As scholars such as Lippitt and Nicole Shukin have argued, animal bodies and lives are intricately interwoven with the new and old technologies, with biopolitics and with capital. In Shukin's influential Animal Capital, she argues that the phrase animal capital materially invests in a world in which species boundaries can be radically crossed, as well as reinscribed in the genetic and aesthetic pursuit of new markets. Crossing species boundaries has led me in other research to posit a technological species and cyborgian subject in performance. It is through blurred or porous boundaries where we become more attuned and more open to the presence of the non-human forces collaborating with us in the world. To arrive at these positions requires a taxonomic tracing of a lineage of technologized animality. So today I will move through and across three different layers of animal mechanization, what I'm calling mimetic replacement, or mimetic appropriation in automata and robotic forms, biomimetic participation in learning processes, and collaborative co-design in artistic practices to identify where these species crossings might bring the non-human into a more collective association that offers room for non-human animal agency. And sorry, I'm working across many screens right now, so I'm just trying to find where I'm looking. So part one, mimetic appropriation. One of the 100+ robots at the 2017 robots exhibition at London Science Museum, out of these, what caught my eye were the non-human entries. This, the decorative mechanical silver swan from 1773, that when wound up preens itself and gracefully moves around and moves its neck to catch fish. And this, the automaton spider from 1604. The text there reads, "This shiver-inducing spider could scuttle across a table and cause a fright, having been wound up so that the legs would be moved by a tiny mechanism. It was made during the early lifetime of philosopher René Descartes. Descartes later distinguished people from animals, controversially arguing that while we both had bodies and souls, animals had only bodies. They were mere automatons." Here's a close-up of the spider. This spider machine automata is, of course, an object, a mimetic appropriation of what Descartes called animals, natural automaton. In Animals Are Machines, Descartes explains his theory that animals cannot think or have a soul. I know that animals do many things better than we do, but this does not surprise me. It can even be used to prove they act naturally and mechanically like a clock, which tells the time better than our judgment does. This notion, comparing animal nature to that of a clock, set up problematic futures for the animal-human relations, but also highlights an animal technological split that continues today in robotics, where a trend has been to build mechanical models based on animal bodies to enact human-driven goals, such as surveillance or warfare. As Kara Riley has posed in her book, Automata and Mimesis on the Stage of Theater History, quote, the ultimate referent for any mimetic act is the human or the animal body. But our impressions of what reality is and how it functions are directly linked to how it is represented. Mimesis is a force that shapes reality, end quote. But whose reality is being shaped through these imitations? And why bother to use the animal body at all? When researching animal robotics, you'll find a lot of inspiration taken from animal movement, such as this bionic wheelbot. Sorry, need to move the, see, this is the multimedia part. Okay, there we go. Move it up a little bit. This is the bionic wheelbot, which is shaped like a crab, but also it has the ability to curl up and roll like a ball. So all of this you can find on the Festo website as well. Okay. And then also, I just want to show you this one. The hopping kangaroo robot, which just hops, I think. It's kind of cute too. Okay. From delightful and amusing robotic animal entertainers such as the swan, to the use of animal robotics for surveillance and warfare, to the reappropriation of the animal body to solve anthropocentric problems such as climate disaster, animal bodies have been mimetically used for human gain or entertainment. In my 2013 essay, Animal Ontologies and Media Representations, Robotics, Puppets, and the Reel of Warhorse, I open with a hummingbird drone being introduced to a crowd by Regina Dugan in a TED Talk. Dugan, the then 19th director of US's Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, was using it to answer the rhetorical question, what would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail? This question epitomizes the human exceptionalism implicit in many animal-based robotic explorations. Capture the animal body mechanically and then use it in service to human needs. This hummingbird was introduced as a highly maneuverable tool with surveillance, warfare, and search and rescue possibilities. Purdue University has also developed a similar robot which purports to be useful for search and rescue and environmental monitoring and entertainment. Though it's interesting that the pull quote of the article from their developer, Jinyang Dang, changes the tone. And she says, we have demonstrated that a truly biomimetic robot has the potential to perform like a real hummingbird. The ultimate goal is to enable the robot to dance and interact with other robots like real hummingbirds. So I want to distinguish here that although the robots in this section may be called biomimetic, and are constructed to replicate the movement of the animal itself, its morphology, I refer to them as appropriations because in reality, there's really no need to replicate a robot hummingbird to dance with other robot hummingbirds. It's quite an expensive endeavor as a flight of fancy. Though, as I will explain, there are overlapping factors at work and there are possibilities within each consideration for affective change. A lot of money is being put into the development of these animal robots to appropriate animal bodies for their movement capacities. For example, the big dog robot or the mule robot designed to carry very heavy loads. There's also something called the Plu robot, which looks like a skeletal salamander. This robot required extensive study and x-rays of salamander movement to understand how vertebra movement might improve human prosthesis. These robots are about human progress and maintain an inspired reverence for the qualities we wish to appropriate, but at the same time seem to bracket off other parameters about the animal in order to make the robots a success. A better question then to pose might be a reversal of Dugin's question, what would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail? And that is, what could or would we attempt to do if we could acknowledge our failures and take time to learn from and value the non-human animals inspiring these innovations? There have been many robot failures, such as that big dog, who was built for carrying heavy loads through dangerous terrain, but was taken out of commission. Yeah, it's incredibly loud. But kind of fun to watch. Okay. Or if you just Google spot robot fail, you'll see the smaller dog-like robot at a Boston Dynamics presentation collapse and seem to convulse on stage. And in a vaguely animal form, our hearts go out to the convulsing dog, but these examples are always less about the animal and more about replicating their movement patterns. Movement has always been the main objective of mimetic appropriation strategies, from bird flight to harnessing quadrupedalism, from mimicking the serpentine and rectilinear movements of snakes to capturing saltation or hopping movements of kangaroos. Humans capitalize on animal bodies. Like the hummingbird, insects provide another fascination due to their small size and their ability to go into spaces we humans cannot. The development of insect drones is still far from being implemented successfully, but may offer an encouraging model for mimetic appropriation that spotlights not only their movement patterns, but also allows for a deep focus into their biology and behavior that draws attention to issues such as climate change. One such example, there are several being developed right now, but I'm going to focus on one today, are the robo-bees. These are in development from the Wyss Institute at Harvard, which are lighter in weight than the hummingbird and described as, quote, insect-inspired robots with potential uses in crop pollination, search and rescue missions, surveillance, as well as high-resolution weather, climate, and environmental monitoring, end quote. Their website remarks that they are inspired by the biology of a fly and that they achieve vertical takeoff, hovering, and steering. The mechanics of this development are remarkable, and researchers have discussed how much effort has been invested to learn how to achieve the actual flight and maneuverability. I'm interested in the deep engagement with the actual living animal that has to happen to achieve this range of flight parameters. While comments following the articles about these intentions rightfully critique human development of bee replicas rather than working to combat the destruction of bee environments, and I don't disagree with this critique fully. However, I also argue that the level of intensity needed to replicate even the insect's movement and the length of time spent studying them has the possibility of producing a becoming animate in the human researcher and in the robotic insect itself. And these becomings can only reflect back on the living bees themselves. These are long-term projects that have required a lot of trial and error. In a video from National Geographic, Robert Wood, who's a core faculty member at the Wyss Institute, ends by saying, "How many robo-bees have we crashed? All of them. We build, we test, we build, we test. If you don't fail, you don't learn enough." This sense of being willing to fail, to take time, and to learn from these robotic animal agents has some potential to counter the mere mimetic appropriation of many of these experiments. To fly like a bee, humans have to think like a bee. Do I think this replication is designed to replace the living creatures? No. Do I think there are real questions about the potential use? Yes. Here, for example, is a response to the research about the mechanics of those technological creatures that say that making animals and machines highly agile and maneuverable and that they can be quieter and inflict less damage if they come into contact with people or property. Here's a little video from their website. Let's just listen.
These miniature robots are inspired by the biology of bees and hive behavior. New materials, compact high-energy power sources, and new control systems, and a new method of self-assembly and pop-up manufacturing. I'm Elizabeth Farrell, a PhD student at SEAS. I am energized by the potential of an autonomous device that thinks on its own. It could impact everything from crop pollination to search and rescue. And that's science, not fiction.
Okay. While the potential uses range from the frightening, thinking on their own, to the beneficial, crop pollination, many bio-inspired mimetic appropriation, while still years in development, have already provoked the fears of their success. The science and the fiction are inevitably intertwined. Like Jane Bennett's examples of the interconnectedness of things in vibrant matter, these things can be considered lively or dangerous. Already these insect drones are controversial figures, generating speculation over their indetectability or fear that they might surveil or take DNA samples. And here's where the real and the fiction get intricately interwoven. Fiction, usually a step ahead of public knowledge, is already projecting these fears. Take, for example, the episode of, let me see here, of Charlie Booker's Black Mirror called Hated in the Nation, in which autonomous drone insects are programmed to kill, in this case, hated people in society. It's a terrifying episode. Or an episode later from the later season called Metalhead, that shows the dystopic side to such robotic animal figures, in which a dog robot is programmed to relentlessly pursue its enemy and kill its prey, in this case, humans who resist the system. And while I don't doubt the nefarious possibilities of these drone animals, and the fictions are not helping really, excuse me, I want to, the fictions do not help to identify possible interspecies crossings that might also shape the future of these figures. There are actual reports of people reporting the sighting of robotic bees on sites like Snopes that turn out to just be regular dragonflies. Because in actuality, they're extremely hard to create due to the complications of aerodynamics at such a small scale. And because building the wings needed to deal with wind flow is still a huge engineering challenge. This, and perhaps more importantly, there's the real question of something so expensive being swallowed up by living birds. This is all to say that these things already have an agency, and they're being understood as a double-edged sword because of it. In the age of the Anthropocene, bee populations are being decimated, and the turn to these animal robots, while potentially able to assist existing bees and pollinate alongside them, is only ever necessary because of the human hand, which then might turn them into dangerous uses. But at the same time, they provoke, whether over bee population decline or whether they will work with living bees to help pollination. In the case of these robo-bees, humans are already learning from actual bees to solve some of the problems that humans have created. Their development might be a step toward adjusting a balance in which actual bees could be assisted by their robotic counterparts. Part 2, biomimetic participants. I'll start with this quote: humans frequently exploit nature to design better robots, and we occasionally design robots to increase our understanding of nature. By simulating biological entities, robots can shed light on natural selection, animal physiology, biomechanics, and behavior without humans ever having to interact with living organisms. So within the last section, I explored non-human animals that were replicated robotically, largely because of their structural frames and movement patterns. As a tool for human use, some of those mimetic appropriations were divorced from their animal natures and put in service to humans. One engagement with the animal is through the mechanics of movement. Although there is room, as I hope I've showed, for humans to be positively influenced through such study, In this next section, the human is at a further remove, allowing the non-human animals and technological counterparts to interact, placing the animals and the robots into a participatory role. Interactive robots are defined as robots able to interact with living systems. And in the 2020 article, Interactive Biorobotics, author Edouard Datteri looks at the methods in the range of studies using interactive robotic models in animal research. And he says that robots can exert transitory or even permanent influence on the behavior of animals and humans is obvious. Surrounding living systems are likely to be temporarily or permanently affected by their behavior. This influence then is crucial for my thinking. Whether animals should be used by humans is a larger debate, but within the many human and non-human animal entanglements, I'm looking for these sites of exchange, of influence. These are not equal exchanges, of course, but in this section, the robots, both non-representational and realistic, not only interact with, but are also able to influence the non-human animals as interspecies participants in the studies. In Robots in the Service of Animal Behavior, researchers Barrett et al. Explain that physical models have long been used in the study of animal behavior, describing some of the many forms these models have taken, such as bizarre, impossible taxidermy of predatory birds, fake chameleon heads on sticks, horse mannequins, zebra costumes, glass beads as termite eggs, two-dimensional gull puppets, a cotton-filled fabric Indian cobra, and use of fake fur over wire and wood. As someone who's written about taxidermy and performance, these examples are exciting. They raise questions also of a performing animality, shameless self-promotion, that has relied on animal representation to enact human-animal engagement, an engagement that has now extended into robotics. I mention these examples to note that the mimicry here is in relation to behavior rather than movement. And so the robotic non-human animal may or may not need to be a realistic representation of the animal itself. The two examples that I want to share in this section are ones in which animal behavior is studied, but with an attempt to remove the human as human from the experiment. In one, a behavioral study with cockroaches, the robotic insect takes a non-realistic form. And in the other, an entertaining television show, the robotic animal counterparts are hyper-realistic. Both are placed into environments with living animals and often offer possibility for behavioral change. Why, ask researchers Barrett et al., would a biologist choose to conduct research with physical models rather than with living animals? And their response is that artifice can broaden the scientist's toolbox, and physical models are easier to handle, and researchers can control where they are placed. Still, and always looping back to the human, the shift towards interactive robotics is one in which researchers may begin to learn about non-human animals from the perspective of a version of the animal itself. In these studies, interdisciplinary researchers from entomologists to zoologists to roboticists attempt to bring animals and robotic behaviors more in sync by designing robotic participants for these studies based on the animal behavior rather than its mechanical construction and movement. So what is possible if living and robotic agents work together? In what are being called mixed societies, non-human animals are learning relationally from robotic versions of themselves. And in these studies, the focus is on small animals and insects like fish. There are studies about bees and cockroaches. These robotics emerge from the field of biomimetics, or the imitation of biological processes. By focusing on relationality and behavior, boundaries between the human, non-human, technological begin to become more porous and offer deeper possibilities of interspecies learning. I will focus on one ongoing study written up in 2007 as Social Integration of Robots in Groups of Cockroaches to Control Self-Organized Choice. Researchers Jay Halloy and et al. Describe the experiment. Our experimental setup consists of a circular arena endowed with 2 shelters. In the presence of 2 identical shelters large enough to host the entire group, all the cockroaches chose collectively to rest under one of the shelters. When one shelter is darker than the other, cockroaches select the darker shelter. The robotic cockroaches seen here, called INSBOTs, were introduced to the living roaches to try to alter the shelter selection behavior. In this study, the robots were not mimetic reproductions, but biomimetically designed to affect the behavior of the living cockroaches. They did not look at all like the animals themselves, but because cockroaches respond at a molecular pheromonal level, the robots were designed with this in mind. The research explains that cockroaches carry on their cuticle a blend of molecules that represent their identity. Acceptance of robots within a cockroach group is related to the ability of robots to bear the correct chemical signal. So this was one of the first studies using interactive animal robotics. And although cockroaches on their own gravitate to the darker shelters, when the robotic roaches were introduced and programmed to go to the lighter shelter, the behavior of the live cockroaches was changed. So they too went to the lighter shelter. In an essay about an earlier stage of this project, Shoshana Magnet emphasized the relational possibilities of this work. Quote, "To engage is relational and opens up broad possibilities for communication," end quote. This biomimetic study's focus on relationality points to what might enable more of an exchange and less of a replication. What questions, Magnet asks, help us to consider the permeable boundaries between insects and machines? So the assumption of a permeable boundary is where biomimetics and studies like this begin to approach strategies for becoming animate, or being able to allow the findings, learning from each other, to influence the relationships with the non-human in perhaps more nuanced ways. The living cockroaches were influenced behaviorally by their robotic counterparts. Now, while these influences are currently unidirectional, the robotic agents influencing the behavior of the living animal, researchers suggest that influences such as AI will begin to shift this balance. Quote, "There is still much room for improvement and adoption of interactive robots. Advances in robotics and machine learning will allow the next generation of interactive robots to learn optimal behavioral responses," end quote. All of the agents in these studies are capable of learning. And this same report suggests that, quote, "Dyadic interactions in which a robot and a biological agent try to outsmart each other could be a promising testing ground for future experiments, providing insights into the strategic capabilities of animal minds," end quote. The question then is, if the animal is learning from the AI, is it possible that in time the AI will also learn from the behavior of the animal? The biomimetic qualities of the INSBOT were not visual representations, but rather accepted through their pheromones. However, the issue of biomimetic realism becomes much more critical when attempting to observe animals in environments without human influence. In this next scenario, the human is replaced by the animal robot, in this, as is the case in the BBC PBS TV series some of you may have seen, Spy in the Wild. The lifelike robots created for the television series Spy in the Wild are constructed according to the promotional material to, quote, "travel the world to understand the true nature of the animals they meet," end quote, including robotic otters and spy crocodile hatchlings, spy egrets living alongside elephants, meerkats and wild dog pups, penguins that can get up when they fall. These episodes show extraordinary advances in animal robotics that can be placed alongside the actual animal and be accepted in environments in which humans would alter the behavior. These robotic animal agents become a prosthetic eye through which humans can take a step back and observe without disturbing. These spies serve a dual purpose. They're visually made for television entertainment, and they're also fitted with high-definition cameras for eyes. But what these eyes reveal has also been reported to astound anthropologists who can see through these cameras in closer proximity to the animal colonies than usually possible. Working with larger species such than the cockroaches, species whose behavior could be impeded by human proximity, scientists, zoologists, and biologists make up their design team, aiming for as realistic an approximation in visual look as well as in eye and facial movement. In an interview with designers Phil Dalton, Hugh Williams, and Matt Gordon of John Dower Productions, they explain that while the look and movement must be meticulous to be accepted into the animal environments, and they also focus carefully on the behavior of the animals, and they've learned a lot from scientists. They describe the details around their spy turtle that, as you can see, the spy turtle looks incredibly realistic and even gulps like the real turtle, and that she can walk, move her head with a camera in the eye, and even lay spy eggs, her own batch of eggs with cameras inside. What I would like to argue here is if we can see through their eyes, perhaps we can see them better through our own. This is just a little clip of the show that's worth looking at.
There was a lot at stake. Spy Pup is the result of a huge amount of work in a small London studio. Beneath the skin is a miracle of animatronic engineering. A skeleton of articulated metal limbs controlled by sophisticated electronics and servos. The moves of the different creatures' real-life counterparts are programmed and tested. Each one takes months to design and build.
Okay, I'll leave you there. The data being collected through these robotic animals is already being used in several studies and is remarkable in seeing animal behavior for the first time because the robotic animals are accepted where humans are not. There's a story about how hippos are very aggressive towards humans, but that the spy hippo has been able to get in and really allow people to see humans in hippos in a completely new light. These seem like extraordinary developments that will likely have deeper impact when removed from the television context. In a behind the scenes feature, head of natural history commissioning for the BBC, Tom MacDonald, comments that the show is full of new revelations and insight to the natural world. Although some of the behavioral considerations were to protect human investment, like the making of the prairie dog so submissive so that it wouldn't be torn apart by the pack, there's definitely a financial impact there. But despite the detail and observation about the behaviors of the animals, episodes of the show are focused around human interests and human projections like mischief, love, friendship. But MacDonald goes on to say that, in particular, the series sheds a light on the similarities in behaviors between animals and humans. Endowing animals with human emotion used to be frowned upon by scientists, but that has changed over the past 10 years, says Downer. You can't spend any time with animals without realizing that so much of what they do is so much like us. It's inevitable, really. We are animals, end quote. And that we are. And this inevitability may well always create relational structures in which humans remain dominant. However, perhaps my argument, seeing through the eyes of the robotic animal to better see the actual animals, will remind us and reinforce us of our similarities rather than our differences. Getting a literal bird's eye view into animal behaviors might facilitate new forms of interspecies communication. Part 3, collaborative co-design. And there's a trigger warning because some of these images contain meat and animal parts, although they're not gory, they're quite beautiful. In this final section, and perhaps the most elusive, the technologized non-human actor moves from mimetic appropriation and biomimetic participant in human studies to the role of co-designer. In all of these cases thus far, the living animals are already technologized, as I set out initially, and across the talk, the triangulation between the three elements becomes more interreliant. There is an overlap across all of these sections, but here, and perhaps because this moves us into an art and performance realm, the elements resonate more equally, and there is an attempt to acknowledge the technologized animality. Art and performance may be more likely to remove the need for outcomes and bring the non-human animal actor into closer conversation and relationality with the human. This is where I find the most fruitful possibility for reflection and for change, for interrelational thinking. Once more, I'm aware that the human is still the driver of these works. It is the nature of any human activity. However, my hope is that with the rise of animal studies and the next generation of artists and scholars and scientists, the ideas of collaboration and co-design might bring the non-human animal into focus as a partner worthy of greater agency. I turn to the concept of co-design, a concept that has emerged from the field of design and depicts a collaborative, creative process with stakeholders. It's a creative design process that's been applied to various models: researchers and communities, adults and children, web designers and hacking. And these are just some of its applications. It's not a term generally used to describe art and performance making processes, although these can be highly collaborative, or to apply to human and non-human participants. But I'm thinking about it here because it's a method and process that seeks to put its participants on a more level playing field. In co-design as collaborative research, authors Zamanopoulos and Alexiou explain that co-design activity produces new knowledge as people develop and experiment with new ideas around matters of concern and as they engage in negotiations around the development of these ideas. Co-design is becoming important in the face of complex social, political, environmental, educational, and technological issues where no one person has the knowledge and skills to understand and solve them, and where a different approach is needed to empower people to participate and take control of their own life and environment. In this process, as the authors state, the position is about sharing ideas. And this for me implies that in order to solve complex problems, we must listen to all involved. So if we face a future of climate disaster, of increasing zoonotic pandemics, or just outrageously outdated practices of treating animals, then these non-human animals whose lives are impacted or taken because of these practices must be represented somehow. As an aside, it's interesting to me to note that they use the term matter of concern, which Latour brings up as a risk-taking proposition. For him, matters of concern take on the aspect of tangled beings, he said, and he differentiates it from the more rigid matters of fact. While there are many examples of artists working with animals in performance, theater, and art, I want to conclude today with one example because of its attention to the three elements of my inquiry: the human, the non-human animal, and the technological. I've been working with artist Du-Sung Yu for several years now, writing about his extraordinary work, which indeed take us back to Latour's new entities with uncertain boundaries, entities that hesitate, quake, and induce perplexity. Yu has developed and performed with a range of what he calls organ-machine hybrids that challenge the boundaries between the human, animal, and the machine. Here we see the Aqua 001 CO2 robotic pig heart jellyfish and the installation called Lai, robotic cow tongues. In these works, the animal is not always mimetically representational, but often abstracted, cyborg, evoking, quaking indeed. Here's another performance work, a pig bladder clouds, all found on his website, and I urge you to go check him out. I've argued elsewhere that these works almost force the world of the animal into focus. It's hard to unsee some of these entities, and they resonate and fill me with questions. They are intended to provoke questions about the use of animals in science, technology, art, and ultimately, they evoke in me a trace of the animal left behind. At least I keep writing about them. And through their complex entanglements with performance and technology, they challenge concepts of technologized animality. Yu's recent piece, which I wrote about in the June issue of Performance Research, called Becoming Leeches, Episode 1, Having Dinner, pushes his hybrid work further into a complex triangulation of the human, animal, technological through a performance art VR installation work. in which, as he puts it, humans interact with live and animated leeches to forge a necessary alliance to arrive at a better world. In this work, live audiences feed live leeches from meat that the chef, you, gives them. And this act generates virtual leeches, all supporting survival for the others within the experience. Within the VR game, the player becomes a leech flying through the air away from the polluted world towards a utopic island. For the purposes of this talk, I'll let the work speak for itself through a relatively short video, 2 minutes, I think, that is also available on his website. Okay. The piece continues Yu's focus on interspecies relationships and brings the live animal, in this piece, the leech, in relation to human audiences, who in turn interact through a virtual reality experience with animated leeches. Like the researchers in the previous 2 sections, Yu carefully researched the leech through its history in medicine and through questions of survival strategies, a theme that runs through the experience. The piece foregrounds a mutually beneficial relationship between all elements and all participants in the game. And the performance, they all have to work together to create this art interface. As I discuss in the performance research essay, Yu provides a focus on care and hospitality in this work. And it is up to the hybridized collaborative efforts of all agents in the room to lead the player away from the island. And the player has to locate the rainbow leeches who are triggered by these nourishing the live leeches to be able to ascend off the island. For this work, all elements must be nourished. And Yu includes a moment in the installation room in which he, as the chef, places a live leech in the palm of the human participant's hand alongside a flower and a piece of meat to nourish the leech. Rather than being repulsed by the leeches, he found that this connection translated into a deeper sense of familiarity that produced an investment in supporting the survival and nourishment within the VR experience. This form of hybrid network fosters a collaborative performance experience across the human and non-human players in the room. This co-location has the possibility of changing the experience so the player in VR is suddenly accountable to the others in the space. Although Yu doesn't refer to his work as being co-designed, he created this piece with a conscious attention to how the leeches, living and animated, perform. And while they cannot express their collaboration and thus cannot be seen as co-designers, from a human perspective, they are active participants, even if just by feeding on what is provided to them. They're nurtured and they've been represented by you. This work draws together stories of leeches as bloodsuckers, as beneficial to humans for their anticoagulant substance hirudin in their saliva, as collaborators in performance. Within Latour's notion of the collective, what is crucial is that the non-human is represented. In Yu's work, these technologized animals are represented within an interspecies environment of reliance and hospitality. The piece then creates a multi-optic vision to return to Claire Jean Kim, which again she proposes as seeing from within various perspectives, moving from one vantage point to another, inhabiting them in turn, and holding them in the mind's eye at once. It is an attempt to recognize each element and to encourage what she calls an ethics of mutual avowal, or a turning toward. Yu is seeking to understand, interpret, and address how interspecies relations might be more careful, how we gain empathy for or turn toward the non-human animal. He asks, might it be possible to reassess traditional relationships and reinterpret animals in new relational strategies alongside advanced technologies? Could we create two-way communications rather than stubbornly holding on to one-way relationships with animals? To be open to two-way communication, the complex relationship between human, non-human animal, and the technological has to be foregrounded and analyzed. In so doing, these animals in the machine, through mimetic appropriation, biomimetic participation, and into a process of co-design, expand the concept of technologized animality to become less human-centric and begin to include these robotic animal agents of change. My hope is that by understanding these unruly agents as actors in a complex theater of the world, we take a risk towards a more ethical and environmentally aware future. I want to end now with a quote from Latour and a little bit of fun. Latour says, actors are defined above all as obstacles, scandals, as what suspends mastery, as what gets in the way of domination, as what interrupts the composure and the composition of the collective. To put it crudely, human and non-human actors appear first of all as troublemakers. So let's all go make some trouble. And I want to end here with just a little fun. Okay, and that's it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jen, for this very stimulating and fascinating lecture. We are very happy that you're here with us today. And we're going to open the floor now for questions, and the participants can ask questions in Q&A or they can ask questions in the chat. And so as you think about what question to ask Jen, I want to offer maybe some remarks to move us from Jen's wonderful presentation towards the Q&A process. First, Jen, it made me think about the concept of universal design, yeah, which initially the idea was that it's going to be designed for a spectrum of abilities and capacities. And most recently, I have been thinking about the concept of universal design as also including animal companions and animal, you know, cohabitants. Yeah, you have apartment buildings with dog parks and houses with a special, you know, bathrooms for dogs and things like that. You know, and gardens with bird feeders and so on and so off. And so and you know, what would be the next step, kind of beyond the universal design, which would also include animals as kind of cohabitants of, you know, of our planet and our living spaces. Conceptualizing that sort of design that is even beyond and above universal design. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. It's a great point to make, Magda, and one I definitely want to think more about. I think that it's that the notion of design, and the reason that I use the idea of co-design is important looking to the future. I think those kinds of things that you suggest may really very well work towards what I'm trying to talk about. Of course, I think we're very we're quite familiar with the kinds of animals that already get that kind of treatment with, you know, with dogs and birds and cats. We have animals that can go on planes with us. But I think maybe that's also why I was slightly interested in talking about the cockroach, right? Because we really tend not to think about cockroaches in the same way as we think about other animals. But some of this work that's being done with the smaller animals, I think, is really crucial because it opens up that same kind of at least exposure and thinking about the animal in a way that, you know, we're not comfortable with and we're not used to. But in a way, maybe you're right. Maybe it has to be built into design practices and into structures so that we can start to see these animals a little bit more ethically as well. I mean, there's a big disconnect between the animals that we are very happy to have around our house. You know, my cat has yet to make an appearance, but you know, and the ones that we try to push away and push to the side and not think about, you know, so that we can eat them and process them. And I think that that's one of the things I'm trying to do is think about, like, even if you do eat them and process them, how do we do that ethically? How can we really become more attentive and attuned to these animals in our world and not just push them off to the side, you know? So I think design is a great way forward in that regard. Thanks for bringing that up.
And also, you know, thinking about all of those ethical questions and the engineering and technology that goes into it, it's difficult not to notice the role of the performing arts and film and, you know, and theater in driving a lot of this thinking, because you know, like what the line from puppets to animatronics is quite, you know, straightforward. Yeah. You know, we as a theater people, we have struggled with biomimicry with puppets, you know, for quite, you know, many centuries. Yeah. And so I think that you know, our field has quite a role to play in trying to define how those animal agents, robotic animal agents, can potentially function within our societies, both, you know, phenomenologically, but also ontologically. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the essay that I mentioned, the robotic the warhorse essay, was really looking at the ontology of the horse through all the different permutations from the novel, the real horse, the play, the film, the animatronic horse that was in the film, etc. So I really think there's, you know, theater and performance has a long history of working with animals, and a lot of people who are, you know, writing about animals are writing about the living animal in relation to the human on stage. And I think I've just been really invested in the non-human animal technologized because of the cyborg interest that I have. But I think that together, like, I really think we can, you know, do quite a lot of interesting things thinking about these roles in theater and performance. And, you know, when I study these the cockroach research, some of the research is so technological, like, and it's just like, you know, very scientific, and it really in its own way divorces the animal to get to the results. And I think the one thing that theater and performance can do is really think about those resonances and what it means to be in the space together, and what it means to think with another. And I think we do kind of imprint upon each other in that way, and in a way that I think a scientist can take a bigger remove from. So.
This also made me think, that the way that you think about those animal agents, robotic animal agents, as a kind of familiarizing devices which will make animal world more familiar to us, and which might in turn induce a more humane treatment of animals, and be a foundation of a certain animal liberation processes which kind of sort of started but have been stalled for a variety of reasons. And this made me think about a bunch of theorists of race and disability, and I'm thinking here, Zakiya Jackson and Sunara Tyler, with her book on the Beast of Burden, the Animal and Disability Liberation, where there is a sort of underlying assumption that animality has been put in such a juxtaposition with humanity, and what does animality entail, and what does the humanity entail in this relationship, oftentimes intertwined with the issues of race and disability, and potentially both Jackson and Tyler seems to suggest that there cannot be a kind of a true human liberation until there is animal liberation, simply because the hierarchy that we're using will always leave somebody behind, as not being fully human. Like in some ways, there is an assumption that some people are mainly mimicking humanity rather than they are humans. Yeah, and so until this line is blurred, we can't move forward with human rights advancement. And so it's very, very interesting what you're proposing, that advancement and research on those robotic animal agents can help us potentially, have that sort of liberatory potential in those discourses. Yeah.
I'd like to think so. I think that I believe those things. I think it's really an important thing to think about. I find that it's a bit perplexing how we can think about animals in the way we do, and treat them the way we do, and then expect the world to change. I mean, and I do agree with some of those theorists, and I would hope that I don't know, it's hard sometimes when you're writing in theater and performance studies, and you start to dip into these other disciplines, and I don't know how to make that interconnection, right? I think that's one of the things that I'm interested in, is how my research can be understood by the people who are doing some of the scientific studies, because what I'd like to know, and I haven't really been able to talk to the people in the studies. I'm still in a reading about phase, but are they influenced by the animals that they research? I mean, you think that animal anthropologists definitely are. I don't know about the study about cockroaches, but I'm really curious. I think when you spend that much time with an animal, studying it, learning about it, looking at its every movement, there's part of me that thinks and hopes that there is a way forward, because and as the technology changes, and we don't have to, we can really work with technological agents alongside animals. I think that hopefully that will lead to changes in animal testing and animal experimentation as well. So yeah, I mean, that's my hope.
Thank you so much for bringing to our attention Yu's work, which is so transmedial, yeah, because we,
Yeah.
in some ways, the Delicious project uses transmediality to kind of help us understand and build the relationship, and also create art. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He might be watching. I don't know. I feel this is a funny platform because I don't see anybody. I mean, now I see you, but before I didn't. But he might be here as well.
Yeah, he's here. You, if you wanna join us, feel free. So if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to read them for Jen.
Yeah, and if you have questions for Dusong, if he's here, he can answer them himself. But his work, the website is extraordinary, and you can see he's very generous with showing his work, and you can see a lot more about the work that I showed today, and some of it is quite spectacular. But we've had long conversations about the role of animals in art and performance, and I think we're very much on the same page about it. So.
Any questions? All right. Jen, thank you so much for this lecture. We appreciate it very much. And we also want to thank Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard and MetaLab at Harvard for hosting and co-sponsoring this lecture. We will be posting it soon on Mahindra website. So if you want to rewatch it, feel free to do so once it's posted. Thank you everyone for participating. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much, Magda.